Welcome everyone to this year's celebration of cooperative innovation. Community wealth building is a people-centred approach to local economic development. The idea is that redirecting wealth back into the local economy through, for example, cooperative ownership, progressive procurement and the use of local assets. It reduces inequality, creates good jobs and supports keeping money in the local economy. My name is Councillor Paul Cassidy and I'm Vice Convenor for Environment Regeneration at Inverclyde Council, but today chairing this panel in my role is Vice Chair of the Cooperative Councils Innovation Network. Today's session will be led by highly regarded practitioners coming from organisations that are highly respected when it comes to community wealth building. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to take this opportunity to celebrate the Cooperative Councils Innovation Network. As a cross-party special interest group of local government association, we are proud that both councillors and officers are engaged in our network. The CCIN is a collaboration between local authorities who are committed to finding better ways of working for and with local people for the benefit of their local community. We provide a national voice for cooperative councils informed by real experience and practice with the aim of drawing on, influencing and framing national policy and political debates about the future of public services, local democracy and communities across the country. The network is open to all UK councils regardless of political affiliation who can demonstrate innovation and a willingness to drive forward the Cooperative Councils agenda. We currently have 118 members, of which 44 are full member councils who represent over 12 million citizens and have a combined budget of £20 billion. We also welcome associate members from town, parish, community councils and opposition groups. We have a growing group of affiliate members who are values-based and non-governmental organisations who wish to show their support and engage in developing innovative cooperative councils. And our supporters are 21 individuals and organisations wishing to show their support to the CCIN. As part of our dialogue with our members, council leaders have identified two key themes: community wealth building and cooperative placemaking. These two lists you see on your screen are not exhaustive, but are more a framework to aid delivery and inspire. Our network works because our members put in just as much as they take out, and one example of this can be found among over 600 examples of best practice case studies published in a searchable format online and accompanied by our annual booklet. CCIN members are encouraged to suggest projects where they can work with other members to find cooperative policy solutions to the challenges facing local government. This slide shows a selection of documented solutions and toolkits available on our CCIN website. The work is divided into large cooperative projects called policy labs, where members work together, and small projects called policy prototypes, where members may wish to try something in the locality on behalf of the network. 2025 saw the CCIN launch our very own social values toolkit at the Local Government Association conference in Liverpool. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Simon Grove-White to our session. He is one of the report's authors and now works as a senior policy researcher for CLES. So today's panel, I'm joined by Sarah Longlands, Chief Executive, and Simon Grove-White from the Centres for Local Economic Studies, CLES, and one of our newest affiliate members to join the CCIN. And we also hope to be joined later by Councillor Matthew Brown, leader of Preston City Council and the driving force behind the Preston model of community wealth building. We're proud that Preston City Council are a full member of the Cooperative Councils Innovation Network. These two presentations will share a huge deal of knowledge and experience from organisations that are highly regarded as not just conceptualising community wealth building, but actually delivering positive local benefit. We'll follow these presentations with a question and answer session to the panel at the end. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sarah and Simon from CLES.
Thanks very much, Councillor Cassidy. I hope you can hear me okay. And just a really big thanks to the Cooperative Network and to all of you for coming along this morning. It's great to be here and it's great to be a member of the network as well. And today is just a chance really for us to share some of our thoughts on community wealth building, and also, as Councillor Cassidy said, to give you some examples of where we've done it in a bit more detail, and hopefully really just to open up a conversation about the real potential of using community wealth building to deliver really good outcomes for people and place. And I think particularly in a time when lots of uncertainty, lots of challenges, I think now more than ever we need opportunities to think differently and to kind of push beyond some of the orthodoxy that we've seen so much over the last sort of few years. So I'm going to just start by telling you a little bit about CLES. So CLES is the, can I move the slides? I'm just thinking, or, oh yeah, great. So CLES, we're the Centre for Local Economies. We're an independent economics think tank, we're a charity, and we work collaboratively across the UK to kind of really develop solutions for economies to make sure that they're really rooted in the places that the people call home. And we work with government at all levels and with the private sector and civil society organisations to really understand what we can do to create long-term delivery solutions to the issues that all of us are dealing with at the current time. And we've been very instrumental in the development and implementation of community wealth building in the UK, alongside our partners like the Democracy Collaborative in the US, and obviously work very closely with Preston Council as well, who've really kind of led this in England. So, and incidentally, just for those of you who haven't heard, we are really delighted to say that yesterday the Scottish Government passed the first community wealth building bill in the world, which will make community wealth building an instrumental part of how local government operates in Scotland. So that's quite an exciting moment, I think, for the movement, but I think quite a lot more to do in terms of delivery. But our work at CLES has always been about how do you create economies that really work for people, place, and planet. And when we were set up back in 1986, you know, the argument then was about how does local government intervene effectively in the economy to deliver good solutions for people. And obviously there were lots of challenges back in the 80s, as there are now. And a lot of our work is about reframing the debate around local government finance. It's about saying that local government finance for too long has been seen as a drain on the economy. It's been seen as a problem rather than as an opportunity. And for us, it's about saying public spend plays a crucial role in laying the foundations for a good economy, in the services that we provide, but also in the way that public expenditure can actually support local economies directly and indirectly. And on this slide, I've just given a bit of a flavour of how that works, you know, through employment. So, you know, there are 2 million public sector workers in local government across the UK. So that's a really important part of the UK's workforce. When you look at local government expenditure, which we're going to look at a bit today, you know, there are millions spent through local government expenditure, which again has an opportunity to influence supply chains, to support local economies, and to keep money circulating in local places. When it comes to land, property, and planning, you know, councils in England own around 1.3 million acres of land, and that's just the council. So there's a massive opportunity there to think about how we use land to support local economies, and particularly to leverage new investment and to support community facilities for everyone. And then finally, you're thinking about local government. I think sometimes local government is presented as this kind of drag on the economy, but actually all the councils that I know work in a really kind of entrepreneurial way to support their economies, to support business, and make sure that when they're distributing funds from central government, whether that's Pride in Place or Local Growth Initiative, that money is really being used not just to deliver a service, but to really deliver the wider benefits in terms of employment, in terms of supply chains, and in terms of creating markets for new sectors. So this is kind of where this conversation starts, and thinking differently about public spend as a foundation of a decent economy. And that's very much where CLES begins on this process too. And just to give an example of that, we did some analysis in the West Midlands where we tracked expenditure, we tracked the economic influence of the public sector within the whole of the West Midlands region. And in that region, you've got sort of 60 public sector, what we would call anchor institutions, large public sector organisations that are very much rooted in that place. And we found that collectively they had a spend of around £10 billion. They employed more than 200,000 people. They owned more than 15,000 hectares. And of course, they also emitted more than £1 billion worth of CO2 every year. But our provocation there was, you know, imagine if these institutions were properly funded and were able to work together to coordinate how they use that economic power to really deliver economic and social outcomes for place. So that alignment of finance and place, I think, is crucial in this debate about community wealth building. So I want to come on now just to talk a little bit more about community wealth building in detail, and Councillor Cassidy's already given a really good summary of it. So I mean, just to repeat that, really, community wealth building is a people-centred approach to local economic development, which is about increasing the flow, circulation, and crucially the ownership of wealth. And that's about really democratising the economy so that we're not simply governed by very large organisations extracting money, but we're actually keeping money locally, and we're supporting and reconnecting people to the economic outcomes of place, whether that be jobs or whether it be employee-owned businesses. And for me, it's also about challenging the narrative on growth a bit, and arguing that good economies should be measured by the extent to which they generate good lives and not simply GVA. So that for us at CLES is really what community wealth building is all about. And we tend to think about it as having 5 kind of key levers or principles, sometimes they're called pillars, which really kind of allow you to understand how to deliver this at a local level. The first of those levers is around finance. And I'm sure Councillor Brown will talk about some of the work they've been doing on finance in Preston and the Northwest. But this is really, finance is often seen as one of the more extractive elements of economic development. But for community wealth building, finance is about how do you ensure that financial flows actually circulate, actually make a difference to people's lives. And that finance can be private sector investment, but it could also be public sector investment in the form of funding coming into an area, how to make sure that that money is sticky and really makes a difference to the people in the way that it's intended. Secondly, around workforce. So just go back a bit, Pete, sorry. So just secondly on workforce, this is about thinking about employment and how do you use your employment as an anchor institution to raise the standard of employment across the whole area, whether that's about pay, conditions or progression. Thirdly, land and property. How do you ensure that land and property and the assets held by the public sector as well as the private actually make a difference to the community, whether that's in planning gain or whether it's in terms of community asset transfer. Fourthly, around spending. So often one of the most direct ways in which people engage with community wealth building. So how do you ensure that how you spend your money doesn't just buy you stuff, but buys you wider benefits in terms of social value for that place? And that is about that alignment of financial instruments with economic and place-based strategy. And then finally, ownership. And ownership, of course, runs the whole way through community wealth building. How do we ensure that we're diversifying ownership, we're democratizing ownership, so that everybody can feel part of the economy and feel a sense of agency within that economy as well. And of course, these 5 levers or pillars don't act in isolation, but together they work together as a blended approach to support a stronger economy. And there are lots of overlaps between all of them. And I'm sure you listening on the call will be able to recognize some of the work that you're doing already in each of these areas. And I think we would always say that community wealth building is not a one-size-fits-all. It's got to work with your place. It's got to be tailored to the particular economic and social context that you're working with. So what brings this all together, what brings all these kind of elements together is the concept of anchor institutions. So I mentioned anchor institutions earlier. Anchor institutions for us are those organizations, mainly public, but can be private, which which are much more likely to stay in a place. They're unlikely to leave. They've got a vested interest in the long-term sustainability and health of a place and its people. And so it's about thinking about how do you use the economic strengths of the organization and the investment that they have already in a place to really make that work hard for a place and the challenges that it's dealing with. So that's a bit of a summary of community wealth building. It's a bit of a look at the 5 pillars. It's also talking about the anchor institutions and how they operate. I want to just finish off by talking through a few examples of where we've seen this working in practice at CLES. So the first one, probably very familiar to many of you, but where we've used, particularly looking at the procurement lever to support local enterprise. And this was at Manchester City Council, who we've been working with for a long time on that. We've also done some similar work with the Liverpool City region, but also in Westminster, more looking at kind of social value and how to really use procurement to deliver wider social and economic outcomes. The story in Manchester was that there was a real concern that the city's expenditure on goods and services wasn't really doing enough to support the city's poorest neighbourhoods. So you have all this money coming into the city council, it's being spent but the very little of that is actually making any difference to people's lives. So they created a bit of a social value strategy to capture as much of that money as possible and drive it locally for community benefit. And those were some of the outcomes that they saw. So like an increase in terms of the number of Manchester-based suppliers, an increase in the number of small and medium-sized enterprise and sort of generative businesses, and a number of new jobs and apprenticeships as well. And this was happening at the same time as a lot of new construction projects. So really putting pressure on those suppliers to really do more to deliver for people in the city. So that's the first example. Second example is drawn from Birmingham. So we've had a long-term relationship with the Birmingham Anchor Network. We have one of our team is based in Birmingham and coordinates the Anchor Network. And this is where 7 of the city's largest institutions, again, with a combined workforce of about 50,000 people and a budget of over £5 billion, kind of work together to coordinate their activity. So we've got people like the college, people like the City Council, the NHS, kind of exploring what they could do in a coordinated way to really use their economic power to deliver on some of the city's challenges. So they've developed a number of projects. So there's the ICAM project, which was a targeted recruitment campaign within the NHS, taking jobs to people and supporting them with the third sector to get employment skills and to work with the NHS in order to contemplate a job in health and social care. So very much reversing the recruitment process and getting rid of a 16-page application form in favour of actually working with people directly where they live. They've also got a procurement working group, and the NHS Hospital Trust has been playing a major role in thinking about how they could use their own workforce strategy to tackle health inequalities. And there's lots more detail about that on our website. And then the last example I wanted to mention was a project that we did in the south of Scotland, very deeply rural area, a lot of small villages and towns. Obviously, social housing provision, very, very important, but difficult in terms of encouraging and bringing new suppliers into the area to deliver retrofit solutions. So they used that concept of anchor intentionality. That's concept of they were anchors and they held housing stock to explore, well, how could they kind of work with their own workforce to develop retrofit skills, but also to encourage local businesses as well as businesses from outside the area to come in and invest in the area in retrofit skills. And that was very much focused on the development of green skills and training, and also really close partnerships with local colleges and schools. And again, there's a bit more about that on our website. So that's just some examples, really, just to sort of set the scene and to give you a bit of a flavour of CLES's work in this area. I just wanted to finish off by just giving some pointers as to how you might want to start kind of your own community wealth building journey. Many of you on this call will be already doing lots of this work, but just as a bit of a, but some of you may not be. So just a bit of an idea of how to get started. I think there's something about mapping your money, kind of understanding where the money you spend is going, and really kind of understand how that's circulating, or whether the degree to which it's circulating in their local economy. I think second, there's a bit more punchy, I suppose, but thinking about extraction. We've just done some work last year looking at extraction in the care sector and mapping how much of money that was spent on care in 3 English regions was actually going into the profits of overseas tax havens and bank accounts, and the degree to which that was really being recirculated back into a place. And some of the results of that are, a bit depressing. So we found that sort of more than £250 million was coming off those contracts in terms of profits, and about a third of that disappearing into overseas accounts. So I think there's something about how do you use your commissioning process to kind of design out extraction, to kind of design in the value of local suppliers and local care and local knowledge, and also supporting SMEs, but also worker-owned cooperatives to kind of deliver on some of this work. I think thirdly, there's something about thinking about your anchor network. Who are the anchors in your area, and how could you kind of work with them and coordinate your activity across not just the public sector organisations, but also some of the larger social and private sector organisations, to really kind of raise the bar, raise the standard of what we can achieve together. Fourthly, maybe there's something about thinking about those 5 pillars that I mentioned, those 5 levers, and doing a bit of a diagnostic yourself to explore, well, what are we doing in each of those 5 areas, and perhaps how could we push that? How could we push that further? And then lastly, community wealth building is about all sorts of things, but it's mainly about how do you start to think about your expenditure as a means to do economic development, instead of thinking about procurement or commissioning as a technical exercise, actually seeing it as a lever to support and develop a really good, strong economy. So I think that's also, I think, another way, just reframing how we think about that, and really focusing in on how you can start to not just do that in procurement and commissioning, but kind of widening that out to other parts of the council's activity, like planning, for example. So I'll leave it there, but hopefully that's found useful. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Simon Grove-White, who's a senior researcher at CLES, who's going to talk you through the social value toolkit for community wealth building. So over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and thanks so much to the CCIN for having us here. Very nice to be back talking about this stuff, and hopefully you'll see lots and lots of parallels between the work that we did with the CCIN and the work that Sarah's just brilliantly introduced there. So I'm going to talk through kind of the how and the why of the CCIN toolkit, and then I'll hand it over to Councillor Brown, who's going to further bring this to life with the example of Preston. Next slide, please, Pete. So first thing to say, this was a real collaborative effort. So there were extensive contributions from a wide range of councils, affiliates, academics, legal professionals, and other experts. So there's a real deep dive into current practice and future opportunities to build community wealth. And we really explored some of the sort of process and mindset shifts that were needed. So it is a kind of the outputs are a kind of synthesis of that legal, that philosophical, that practitioner perspective. So there's elements that are quite abstract and technical in places. I'm going to try and keep this very legible, but do ask any clarifying questions in the chat as we go. And just to say, the outputs of the toolkit really reflect that diversity of perspective. So there's a practitioner's toolkit, there's a supporting narrative that really digs deeper into that, and then there's a legal advice on the flexibilities that exist, and a lot of case studies that really show what's possible. But yeah, this sort of touches on a point that Sarah mentioned there. But really, this sort of why was the toolkit needed? Well, community wealth building and the toolkit are really all about trying to reframe the story of why governments spend money. And I think a sort of, we've been locked in this sort of paradigm where, it's been all about value for money, and that there's been quite a sort of narrow way of understanding what value for money means. And we're trying to sort of pull things back up and talk about, this is about maximizing public value, and maximizing public value is all about getting the right thing from the right organization at the right price. But we need to understand what that means much more broadly. So what does the right thing mean to the CCIN or to CLES? Well, in a community wealth building context, a lot of that is about keeping, so just go back one, Pete, so I'll come on to that, thanks. Yeah, so a lot of that is about keeping public wealth flowing through a local economy. Local spend is often important, but just as importantly, as Sarah said, it's the kind of organizations you're working with. Are they paying people well? Do they share the dividends of their successes broadly or narrowly? It might also be about stimulating new and innovative ways of meeting foundational needs in an economy. That could be through public sector collaborations with the BCSE or the social economy. And it might be about using spending power to generate new employment pathways in disadvantaged neighborhoods. So the crucial point really is that it's much broader than just best price. And there's a lot of creativity that we can exercise in pursuing that. So I'm just going to try and illustrate this by talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly in social value. So I'll start on the ugly, looking at a couple of examples. Sarah mentioned the recent report from CLES and partners on 3 combined authority regions. I don't need to repeat the stats, but massive profit extraction, a lot of money being offshored into tax havens. And I think we can trace a lot of these problems back to company ownership structures, the profit imperatives that they impose. So when companies have become sort of so so large that they have kind of de facto monopolies over provision, and they use that position to increase shareholder profits at the cost of workers' rights and service quality and so on, we have a real problem. We also saw that with the likes of Carillion, where local authorities were getting kind of trapped in very complex, vertically integrated service delivery contracts that they had no power to enforce, which ultimately transfers the risk onto the public purse. One of the frustrations is that, you know, often the headlines pin the blame on local government officers, suggesting that this is poor contract management, and actually that's far from the truth. They're usually, you know, doing the absolute best they can with a very weak hand. So we see, just more generally, there's a kind of growing recognition that we're waking up to the social, economic, and environmental costs of certain types of provision. And these are problems that social value powers can and should be helping to address. So next slide, please, Pete. But they won't if we approach it like this. This was one of the sort of fundamental points in the toolkit. So this in and of itself is not a bad thing, but it will struggle to deliver the sort of strategic change that something like community wealth building talks about. So you know, process is slightly controversial, but we think a lot of the problems in social value practice are that it operates in this space where we have a contract over here and we have some nice to have things over there, and the two are treated as quite sort of distinct and separate. And though these things are, you know, all well and good, the social value isn't really contributing to the strategic problems that we're trying to solve. So the toolkit traces a lot of problems back to that. And really what we want to be looking at when we're talking about social value is, you know, what is the social value that we can get from delivering the contract in the most economically, environmentally, and socially valuable way within the resources available. So that might mean in this sort of case, you know, rather than saying, you know, paint some classrooms or do us a workshop, you know, it's about saying, you know, is this bricklayer being paid a living wage? Are you sourcing your cement from local suppliers? Has the design and delivery of this scheme been driven and answerable to the, you know, by a local community? And I think if you apply that principle back to something like profits in the care system, you start to include some of the costs of, start to recognize some of the costs of the way that contracts are currently constructed, and start to make full transparency of cost, profit, and contract spend, then the sharks, you know, those more predatory suppliers will look for easy meals elsewhere, and we can see that already happening in places like Newham and Wigan, where they've made transparency of cost and profit a sort of starting point for contracting with them. So this is really about social value not being reduced to box ticking. So what should we do instead? Well, next slide, please. So just to highlight sort of the kind of, there's a growing canon, I suppose, so of progressive reports that are seeking to reclaim public value as something that goes far beyond market forces. They put an emphasis on strategic upstream thinking, ensuring that opportunities are aligned to priorities, that they're achievable within the market available, and really looking at how do you give those working on these challenges the permissions and the tools to engage and apply a wider range of commissioning tools to the challenge. So I'm going to zoom in very quickly on two of the key processes from the CCIN toolkit, which we think can help. So this is all about how do we approach things in a competitive market, and at the root of competitive procurement is the fact that we're using the leverage of a winner takes all competition to try to maximize public value. So we want the supplier to do something that may or may not be in their private interest, and that's why it's crucial to include that as a requirement in the contract. If we don't include it in the contract, we will struggle to enforce it. So this is all about understanding how do we do this in the most socially, environmentally and economically advantageous way within the resources available. So if you just cycle through a little bit, Pete, so it's all about starting with policy. You know, what steer do our policies give? What do users and citizens understand about the need? What can the market actually provide? Are parts of this that local suppliers, SMEs or social enterprises could deliver? Can we disaggregate our contracts to make it easier to do? So we're really defining a contract in the way that embeds that social value as a deliverable. So it's not a separate percentage, it's part of the quality criteria of the contract. So this is sort of one of the key recommendations of the CCIN report, is that where there's a competitive functioning market, try to embed as many of these principles as possible. But the toolkit also recognizes that sometimes we need to look beyond a sort of conventional competitive procurement process to be able to maximize public value. So not everything works through competition, as we found in the research for the toolkit. So often what we're really looking to do is enable a number of different organizations, all operating with different strengths and capacities, to contribute to change within a complex system. And sometimes approaching the delivery of those complex human services through a purely competitive procurement lens actually locks out the kind of organizations that we might want to work with. They can find that a very prohibitive barrier to entry, and equally a sort of a tightly specified contract that kind of forces someone to deliver something quite narrowly can be very brittle in the face of that sort of complex social change. So kind of some of the key principles that we suggest here are really that it's all about setting the right direction, convening those with an interest in the problem, establishing adaptive governance that can really transparently share risk and reward, and then setting up that governance that allows everyone to work together through a shared purpose. And there are a much broader range of commissioning tools available that can really support this. So we're talking about things like alliance contracts, ethical procurement frameworks, relational contracts, public commons partnerships. There's even an example in the toolkit of using cooperative membership as a sort of a mechanism for collaboration, which is well worth a look. Working out where to start can be challenging for councils. I think a lot of this starts with that sort of bold policy intent, setting some really clear direction and kind of bold intent, and then really looking at, well, you know, how is our current spend addressing these priorities? So looking at the spend, looking at the pipelines, talking to local markets, assessing what the local social economy looks like, seeing what's possible, seeing what's missing, which, you know, where do we need to develop new markets, and then starting to look at sort of specific future opportunities, trying to understand, well, within that pipeline, what are we looking to do? Is it competitive procurement with embedded social value? Is it insourcing, collaborative commissioning, social licensing, and so on and so on and so on? So there's a lot of judgment involved in this, a lot of local context, and that's really something that local authorities are, you know, doing brilliantly in lots of places. Obviously, this is something that we really love exploring as well, and would be happy to support anyone on that journey. So, you know, conscious that some of this is probably quite technical and theoretical, I'd really recommend people read the reports, look at the case studies, to really sort of expand the sense of what's possible. I think that, I guess, the take-home message from the toolkit is really, don't get trapped into narrow definitions of social value. It's all about using those levers to really maximize public value, however that is understood locally. And I'm so delighted really to hand over to Councillor Matthew Brown, who should really bring this to life, I think, by showing how Preston has translated those bold community wealth building ambitions into on the ground action and measurable real world impact. So thank you for listening, and do get in touch if you'd like to talk more.
Thank you, Sarah and Simon, for those interesting presentations on community wealth building, and Simon for that presentation you just gave on our social value toolkit, which is a really key toolkit that any of our members in any local councils should make use of. So next we're going to hear from Councillor Matthew Brown, who is the leader of Preston City Council and the driving force between the Preston model of community wealth building. So over to you.
What we did do in Preston is we had a traditional economic development approach. So what you see there is what was planned for Preston. So this was working with large global developers, and very conventional economic development approach we did have up until about 10-15 years ago. And many economic cultures in the country were around doing this. You try to basically attract large global developers come into your community. Often what is needed to facilitate that is to put public land into a vehicle. So Preston went down this journey for about 10 years or so to try and bring this investment into our community. Unfortunately, the investment didn't happen when we had a global economic crash and the developer and the main store pulled out. So this is why we started doing community wealth building way back in around 2013. So I'll just take you through some of the policies that we've implemented. So firstly, we realised that solely trying to attract money in from outside in a deprived working class community which struggles to get inward investment often was not the best way of doing things. So what we did do is look at what we had already. So as was alluded to before with CLES, you know, we do have anchor institutions in Preston. We've got quite a lot. 2 councils who are headquartered here. We've got a hospital, we've got a university, we've got a large social housing organisation and others, police force, further education colleges. So what we did do is we worked with them from 2013 to try and increase spend a lot more within our local economy in Preston. So that was very successful in the sense that another 75 million was spent with Preston-based businesses. That was often things like construction, local farmers, printers, and other things. So there was a big repatriation of public wealth into the local economy. As we're discussing today, as well as doing that, we do have social value outcomes, which have been very positive for Preston in terms of what we're delivering there. And we also encourage it insourcing as a council, but also with our anchor institutions. So we brought back in-house the management of some venues. We've also brought back in-house homeless services, some homeless services, but crucially, for example, our police and crime commissioner has insourced custody suites about 5-10 years ago back from a corporation into the local public sector. And then as well, we work with our public pension fund, which we're a member of in Lancashire, to try to encourage it to invest a little more directly within the county that most of this money originates from. So what we saw was a £50 million place-based investment by our local government pension fund through the City deal. And we're looking to build on that and look especially for opportunities around whether we can encourage the fund to invest in affordable housing and potentially renewable energy projects within both Preston and the wider county. And then additionally, we're expanding the cooperative sector. So we're very keen on worker-owned cooperatives. We're very inspired by places like Mondragon in the Basque Country. And we're doing that in partnership with co-op development organisations, which we have 2 in Preston. We're getting local trade unions on this agenda and working especially with the communities, because to bring about change, it can't always be done top down by a council leader or a council full stop. You've got to get into communities and explain what community wealth building is. And then also we're leading the charge to establish a regional cooperative bank across the northwest of England, because again, if our minds go back to that financial crash many years ago, it was the structure of our current banking system which caused it. We do not have a diverse banking system in this country, unlike Germany. So we're working with partners to establish a regional cooperative bank called the Northwest Mutual, which we project will reopen branches across the region and obviously lend to local businesses, individuals and charities, social enterprises and cooperatives. Next slide. We're also the first living wage employer as a council in the north of England, and we've become a living wage place, which is very positive, and I'll go on to that later in terms of outcomes. because we did struggle to actually get inward investment into our community, and I think from a philosophical perspective as well. If you go in Preston city centre now, you see cinemas being built, you see museums being refurbished, you see small business hubs, and it's been done primarily in local public ownership. So the assets are actually owned by the city, which will bring them into perpetuity for our community for generations to come. The council is looking to re-establish council housing again, and we're looking to start that this year. And we've used publicly owned land for new affordable housing within Preston. We have planning policies. So if you get large planning applications, we have a planning policy which encourages locally based suppliers and labour in both the public and private sector developments in the Preston economy. And then we've refreshed our community wealth building policies after COVID. So that's things like community land trusts, cooperative and community owned energy, and we've set up a municipally owned broadband company, which we hope will provide free broadband for residents, especially the less well-off communities within Preston, but also recycle devices and other things, as well as what it's doing already, which is connecting community centres and religious organisations and other facilities up for free broadband within our community. So these two slides really show especially what community wealth building has been doing. We've been at it for over a decade. It's been a very long journey. So we're very keen on having a more democratic economy. So that might sound quite theoretical, but in terms of resilience and in terms of allowing our communities to actually take charge of their own economic destinies, I think the more councils that do this at scale, the more we can tackle lots of the social inequalities at a local level within our communities, and also probably have a conversation about how a very different economy could look like. Because I think there are issues around the current economic system, who benefits from it, the wealth inequalities, and how many regular communities are just being left behind, basically, and it's not really working in their interests. Okay, so this is obviously about social values. So obviously that was quite a strategic impression of what we're doing in Preston and are doing, but obviously we do very strongly support social values. So within our contracts, these are some of the things that we do. So, you know, it's very positive looking at fair and democratic working environments and practices. So obviously that is things like a real living wage, access to trade union. But one of the things I am quite proud of is that we do weight our contracts. If, for example, a supplier says they're going to pay above the statutory minimum for sick pay and paternity pay and other things. Obviously, things like getting young people to understand and experience the workplace, supporting moves towards net zero, increasing spending in the local economy, that's central to everything we're doing. And obviously supporting the voluntary community and faith sector. And through social value projects, we've also supported some of the new worker cooperatives we have within Preston, Sound Skills being one in particular, when we actually did build our new publicly owned cinema. Yeah, so I think this is very important. So we need to know if community wealth building works, because we do spend a lot of time discussing these things at a theoretical level. And I do think that we actually need a strong evidence base that community wealth building works. And Preston has been at it probably the longest out of any councils adopting it across the UK. So obviously there has been work looking at just proving that these ideas do work, and I'll speak to you about some of these things. So for example, we do have something known as a good growth index, and it shows Preston doing very well there. And also it does mention there how we did, as well as increasing spend within Preston, we redirected over 200 million with local supplies in Preston and Lancashire between the period 2013 and 2017. Yeah, and again, this is a study that was done by the Lancet actually about 2 years ago. It was CLES involved in this. It was really, really important to just look at whether community wealth building is actually making a big difference to our communities, and it's not just a theory, it is actually making big changes to communities that adopt it at scale. So this is a study, and this shows the control group. So these are councils of a similar size and budget to council in the north of England, and the red line means those that haven't adopted community wealth building, and the green line is Preston. And what it does show is that obviously in terms of public sector spend for the council itself, we are, because we've decided to do this strategically, spending nearly twice as much with locally based suppliers as councils that don't adopt community wealth building policies. Next slide. Yeah, and this is another one from the same study. Again, since adopting community wealth building, it shows that not-for-profits, mutuals, cooperatives, because we've done through a political choice to actually increase our democratic economy. Again, you see the number of enterprises which are actually democratic, obviously significantly higher in Preston than councils that are not adopting community wealth building across the north of England. So I think this is a study of about 20 or 30 councils. Yeah, and very importantly as well, again, because we have taken political choices to radically promote the real living wage within our city, we've taken political choices not to rely on corporate developers solely and actually regenerate things in public ownership and spending locally with our university and other partners. What you do see is that compared to the councils that didn't adopt community wealth building during the period 2015 to 2019, you see how the employment rate was a lot higher. You also see our wage levels were a lot higher as well. And I think a lot of that is down to the promotion of the real living wage, because there's, I think, a workforce of about 65,000 in Preston. There's about 15 or 16,000 that work for real living wage employers. And I think there's about 4,200 people who've had a pay increase. So that's about a quarter of the low paid within our community. Yeah, and again, this shows obviously 11% increase in median wages and 7% increase in employment relative to expected trends. And this study was in the Lancet, which is a very prestigious public health journal, because obviously political opponents who don't support community wealth building in Preston and beyond will say it's protectionist. They're saying that there's no evidence to prove it works. Obviously, there is evidence now that was done through this study, which used government figures and other things. And obviously, it was published in the Lancet because there was also like links to mental health improvements as well. And what we've seen as well in Preston during that period is that wage levels have benefited those, obviously a lot in the bottom 20%. So obviously seeing that out of the wage increases, especially through living wage employment and other things, we are seeing that those benefits are going to those in the bottom fifth of our workforce, and that's positive because it's actively redistributing wealth within our community. And again, this is out of all the councils in Lancashire, so there's 14. What you see, and these are latest figures from this year, a few months back, what you see is that the percentage of jobs paying below the real living wage, Preston is at 12%, and some other councils are up there at like 24%, 20% plus. So obviously it is tackling in-work poverty. So this obviously is, obviously without all these other councils are doing good things, I would say, but obviously in terms of adopting community wealth building, it does show that we are actually having effects on the low paid by the decisions we've taken. Next slide. And then this again is the same study. What it did show is that by adopting community wealth building, you do see there's a little less depression within our community. Now, we are a diverse working class community in Preston. There's been challenges, obviously, with the economics we've had, I would argue, since the late 70s, deindustrialization, inequality, poverty, and the rest of it. But because there are more people in living wage jobs, there is more employment directly. We're doing extremely well in terms of social and affordable housing. We've delivered about 1,800 in the last 6 or 7 years. What we are seeing is we're seeing people who are a little less depressed. And obviously this looks at the control group and it looks at Preston as well. Yeah, and this is very important as well because we're doing a study with CLES as well. Now, it also shows that in terms of child poverty rates within Lancashire, there were 6 councils at a similar rate around 2015. Obviously, these are the very dark days of Tory Lib Dem austerity coming to an end, but also, conservative austerity following that and all the other policies imposed on our communities. And again, what we see is that child poverty rates, even though there has been an increase, because we've adopted these policies, they've increased a little less in Preston than 5 other councils within Lancashire. So what I'm trying to get across today, and I thought I'd have a little different approach, is people have heard the story about Preston many times before, but I do think we got to show community wealth building does work. And I think the more that we do show it does work, the more we can actually get more councils to support it. I've seen in the last week or so, Scotland, the Scottish government has adopted community wealth building as legislation, as a bill. you know, so it is spreading very powerfully across the United Kingdom. There's many other councils and mayors doing it as well. York are on it now, but you know, I do think we've got to have an evidence base that'll show that this is working as a set of ideas. And I think by doing that, it really does embolden us in the movement to actually encourage more people to support community wealth building. And if people are doing community wealth building already, do it a little deeper and a little more transformative, because I think it's a really positive way to tackle inequalities. And that's it. And any questions or answers, just put them my way. And thank you for the invite. Cheers.
Thank you, Matthew, for that presentation. Interesting to hear the work that Preston is doing in the area of community wealth building. So we will next move on to question and answers for our panel. I already see we've got a good couple of questions now in the Q&A section. Just a reminder, if you have a question, you can pop it in the Q&A section, which is a wee bubble with a question mark, or alternatively, you can pop it into the chat. So the first question we have is, how could we encourage councils and other public bodies to focus more on social community ownership and control of wealth rather than largely on jobs and income, important as they are? So I'll go to Sarah first.
Hi, thanks, and thanks, Chris, for the question. I think it's related to your second question, Chris, too, about, you know, how community wealth building can be done in a way which actively involves people and communities. You know, I think that is a really important related question to this as well. I think it's about that partnership working. You know, I mentioned about the importance of working in partnership, and I think probably we don't say enough about how councils have the opportunity to work in partnership with their communities as well. I think there's still a sense of doing to people rather than with, and I think in a time when communities are when councils are so under the cosh when it comes to finance, I think there's a really important opportunity to say, look, at this moment, the greatest allies that we could have to make the case for why public sector investment at a local level is important are the communities that we're trying to serve. So I think there are really good examples of where communities like Wigan and others have really kind of taken a step to sit down with communities and try to build meaningful and genuine partnerships, where it's about listening to communities and it's about exploring how we could co-design services in a way which would address some of those commissioning questions that Simon was raising earlier from the toolkit. Because sometimes the best way to design those services, particularly services for vulnerable end users, is actually to get some of those end users into the room to help inform that process. So I think there's I would be very much supportive of the idea that we should be really exploring ways of genuinely engaging with communities, sharing some of the concerns and worries about the current financial situation, but also bringing them into the room to help design and think about the future in a much more consistent and meaningful way than perhaps is often the case. And I think the other part of that is around community ownership. So there's a bit about talking to communities, but there's all and actually having communities involved in the process. But I think there's also something about community ownership and the control, because that is a really key principle of community wealth building. It's about that, diversifying that. And, you know, sometimes community ownership is kind of focused on community asset transfer, which of course can be a mechanism for that. But I think if we're going to go down a road of community asset transfer, it has to be a meaningful process. It can't just be about offloading what might be a liability. It's got to come with support and long-term investment to help a community develop its capacity and develop its capacity to really make the most of that opportunity in their areas. I think the other related bit to that is on local government reform. I mean, some of you on this call will be contemplating local government reform and going through that process at the moment. And there is a real sort of risk with local government reform that simply it's a kind of selling off of assets, a bit of a fire sale, you know. And I know that there's a big push to use local government reform as a kind of an efficiency saving. But at the same time, I think there's a really important point there to say this is also an opportunity to build councils that are fit for the 21st century, but also I think to build a new relationship with communities and to contemplate how we could make sure that if there are assets that are no longer needed by a new authority? How can we explore how they could be used creatively by the community, for the community, or held in trust for the community in the longer term, rather than simply kind of lost to a place and gobbled up by, you know, a developer who perhaps doesn't, or a landlord who perhaps doesn't have a long-term interest in that place. So I think that's other kind of related aspect of that as well. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, just to sort of build on that a little bit and relate it to the sort of commissioning process itself. I think one of the really fundamental things is having that sort of policy recognition of the costs of the status quo. So, you know, if we're talking about sort of how do you make the case for favoring organizations which you know, which distribute wealth more widely, for example, you've got to really understand the cost of the alternative, and that's where I think, you know, some of the work that CLES have been doing around extraction in the care sector really sort of gives local authorities the kind of the basis to say, actually, you know, our policy will be that we do not you know, purchase from certain types of organizations. So that sort of naturally leans the process towards organizations that don't have those characteristics that do allow a sort of a more local control of wealth. So sometimes it's about naming the problem with the alternative. I think there's an interesting question around sort of development and extractive models of urban development. I think you know, if we want to sort of shift the status quo, we just need to sort of have a slightly more expanded understanding of you know, of the costs of that status quo, and I think provided local authorities have those policy hooks that give them the steer, there's nothing stopping them selecting a whole plethora of different commissioning methods to achieve their aims. So I think that having that sort of clear kind of policy hook is a really important step, and I think sort of so understanding the problem and framing that gives you that. But yeah, totally agree with all that Sarah said there around devolution, and obviously some of the work that we tend to do with councils is really sort of doing a bit of an analysis of, you know, what is your current social economy, how might you sort of stimulate the growth of that social economy, and so that, you know, it's not just procurement and spend that enables that, but yeah, there are other levers and other ways of sort of applying those subsidiarity principles, I think, as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to come at this at a bit of a different angle. I do think with whether it's community ownership or community wealth building more generally, we could do stuff around commissioning, we could do stuff around social value, we could do things as authorities and public bodies, but I do think we've got to really get into communities, because I learned this pretty early on, because I thought a lot of this could be done top down. I think it's really important to work with community organisations, make them aware of economic alternatives, you know, minority communities, women's organisations, trade unions, small business community, religious organisations. I think that's how you bring the scale into it, because we've been conditioned, I would say, to think generally that there's only one way of doing economics in our country for decades. And I think when people actually think that there isn't any alternative, and there isn't much hope to do things in a much fairer way because it's pretty much told to them, this is why we need to work at the grassroots. So I just think that's a really important point. We've learned that in Preston. You know, we're doing some amazing work with GMB Union, for example, around can we look at an cooperative alternative to Uber, and to do that, for it to be successful, we need to work within communities and make them aware that potentially they could actually work for a more generative, fair, democratic business than the one that they might be working in already. So I think that's really important. And I think if we're really interested in bringing this to scale, instead of just have it as an addition to many other things we do with community wealth building, that's how you bring the transformation. It's obviously having progressive councils and cooperative councils, but it's working within communities and getting community support for these ideas. And that's where the hope comes, and that's where the optimism comes in my mind, because I do think that's an essential part of looking at it, you know. Cheers.
Thank you for that, Matthew. So our next question is from Morgan Jones at Cheshire West and Cheshire Council. Is capacity in procurement teams a barrier to this? Does disaggregating contracts mean that you need additional procurement capacity to support that additional procurement and contract management activity? And we'll go back to you, Sarah, to start.
I mean, I think the short answer is yes, it definitely does. I know that right across the UK there's a real capacity challenge when it comes to procurement teams at the moment. And I think sometimes that's about, I mean, obviously that's about, you know, getting the right people in posts and so on, but it's also, I think, about highlighting the importance of procurement and having, you know, really good skilled people in those roles. And I think the tendency sometimes to see that as a purely technical role instead of a really good opportunity to think imaginatively and creatively about how we spend public money. So yeah, absolutely, it's a challenge, but we've you know, there's a real opportunity to think about those roles differently and to attract the right people.
Just to build on that with an example from a council we're working with at the moment, they've been doing this for some time actually, and have, you know, are now beginning to really see the benefits of having that sort of more local supply chain. They did say, you know, it does push a little bit more, you know, capacity through that process. I think there's a question, you know, in my experience, I think a lot of procurement processes within councils have had quite a heavy focus on sort of compliance, understandably. When you're talking about disaggregating contracts, you potentially, you know, you're moving them to lower thresholds. The rules are sort of less restrictive at those thresholds. So I think it's not inevitable that it you know, leads to heavy onerous processes. Some of it is about, you know, what is that core central function that enables the rest of the organization to comply with the processes without being too heavy-handed. And actually the example North Somerset, who we're working with, got a very good balance there of sort of devolving out the decision making and the sort of commissioning power to their directorates, whilst providing sort of light touch support from the centres. So I think there are models that can sort of support that, but yes, inevitably it does mean potentially more contracts, and that does mean more contract management in some respects. I would argue, you know, it's much easier to manage a small scale supplier than a Carillion in a massive, you know, complex contract where all the power sits with the supplier. So yeah, sometimes it's about creating almost more relational contracts and with your local supply chain, because you have a sort of a shared interest with them anyway. So yeah, there's something in there.
Yeah, can I come back in on that just briefly, just to say, I think as well, there's often an assumption that the sort of big is economies of scale and easier to deliver, but actually we know from some of the research that we've done that often you're also paying for extra stuff through a larger contract. You're paying for company infrastructure that they need to subsidize. So I think you do some of the costs in those bigger contracts can be hidden, but can be quite severe.
And yeah, when you add in the sort of, you know, the amount that you're spending on legal fees and external legal support to hold the supplier to account on a contract like that, it really does get a bit crazy. So yeah.
Thanks both for that. Matthew?
Very excellent question, and very important question. I mean, I do think we need to put money in as a political choice to prioritise procurement. Very, very important indeed. As I said earlier, sometimes it's not as easy to bring in money from outside into communities, but there's all this wealth in communities anyway around where we spend and all the rest of it. I wouldn't say it's overly expensive to increase capacity, and obviously there are organisations like CLES that we did work with originally that were very good at doing things like going through the contracts with the organisations, encouraging them to spend locally and the rest of it. I think it helps also having an anchor network. So within Preston, we've got them, as was said before, there's one in West Midlands, there's one in London. And then within that, not only the council, but the local university, hospital, police force and the rest of it, anchor institutions could all work together to spend locally. And again, within Preston, one example we have is about 10 years ago, we were very successful in getting contracts to local farmers. And I think there was about £2 million that was repatriated to the local farmers within Preston. And for those small businesses, getting those opportunities and the jobs that came out of it, it was a huge thing. Construction as well. Again, we've been very, very successful in supporting local construction companies. And what we found is that the smaller, medium-sized businesses, in terms of the social value outcomes, they're very keen to do it. So they do things like become a living wage employee. They will employ people who might have been in prison, for example, and need a second chance. So they're very, very positive about these things. So, as I said, there's a huge amount of wealth in our communities anyway that people may not know within our institutions. I do think it should be a political choice to make sure you have the best procurement teams that get that spend to ripple into our communities and create jobs and wealth within our communities as well.
Thanks, Matthew. So our next question is from Chris Dabbs. How might it be possible to get public sector pension funds to engage in community wealth building? And actually, this is a really good question because I know that's an issue that my local authorities had with our pension fund as well. So Sarah, you start with.
So this is a question that we're exploring in a minute in York and North Yorkshire Combined Authority, where we're supporting them with a Community Wealth Building Commission. And one of the questions there is about how do you start to use pension funds to really deliver on community wealth building? I mean, Matthew would be much better placed than me to answer that because he's been involved at the coalface at some of this. But I think it starts with a conversation between the chief exec or the leader of a council and the pension fund to understand what they're doing at the moment to recognise the value of their fund and how they can start to explore investing some of that fund within the local area. And I think a lot of places are engaging in those conversations now, and it's becoming much more acceptable to start to think in this way. But I think it does start there, and a recognition that in a time of sort of scarce investment from the public sector, that's a really important way of using funds to support the local economy. And I think it's also probably got quite reliable returns when compared to some of the instability we're seeing in global markets too. But yeah, I'll pass over to Matthew because I know that Matthew, you've been working directly on this.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I mean, within Lancashire, we managed to get a £150 million fund for the county, which is very positive. There was 100 million earmarked for Preston and the neighbouring districts. There has been conversations with the Lancashire Pension Fund about investing in affordable housing, which they're looking at. Previously, they did support a housing association called Halo that would provide shared equity properties across not just the region but the country. But there's also some very interesting stuff happening in other pension funds. So, for example, if you go to Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham's new I think investment plan for Greater Manchester, there's 300 million investment from the Greater Manchester Pension Fund in that. They've also invested in social housing and affordable housing as well. There's what's known as the London Fund in London, which I think is putting aside 300 or 400 million for local investment, which includes supporting the voluntary and community sector. So, these things can be done, but they're very, very conservative institutions, and the interpretation of the fiduciary responsibility is very, very strict. They're not, I would say, the most exciting things to sit on either, because they are very technical and other things, pension fund committees. But considering there's £340 billion within these funds, and even the government are currently saying that, there should be at least 5% invested directly regionally and in the United Kingdom, I just think there's a huge opportunity. I think there's also an opportunity for our trade union colleagues in Unison and beyond, because they have representation on the funds, and I believe Unison members would want to see more investment in things like renewable energy generation within communities and social and affordable housing. So I know maybe it could be a topic that CCIN could look at more generally, because I do think there's beginning to be a shift in culture, but I do think it needs to go a lot further. So if we could, for example, get 5% of funds invested directly in the UK in our regions, for example, that would be something like, my maths isn't brilliant, but it would be probably about an extra 70 billion within investment in our country, which would be very positive. Thank you.
Okay, so the next question is a question from Morgan Jones, again at Cheshire West and Cheshire. How does a social license to supply and science presentation differ from a social license to operate? So I'll go to you, Simon, because that seems one perfect for you.
Yeah. So thanks for that. To be honest, I'm not 100% clear on the distinction. I think the social license to supply, what we're referring to there, is a council really identifying what are the imperatives, what are the preconditions that would make someone suitable for delivering this specific service, and that can be understood in a very broad sense. The part of the toolkit that touches on this, actually, there's a section on social value imperatives, which is sort of describing a similar thing. But that's really the example that brings that to life is what Wigan did around their ethical care framework. So they had a number of preconditions. So if you as a supplier want to provide these services, you have to be a living wage employer, you have to be willing to operate on a transparent open book basis, you have to be willing to recruit locally. So these were imperatives, preconditions for entering that process, and that's where I think they differ significantly from a sort of social value menu where a supplier can kind of pick and choose the low-hanging fruit. But yeah.
Thanks for that, Simon. So the next question is from Pete Valens. Pete says, the press journey is a fantastic, inspiring story. The presentation has some fantastic stats to evidence the benefit. How easy is it for councils to document and benchmark their current, and where is the best place to start when it comes to data? And I'll go to you, Matthew, first.
Yeah, again, CLES might want to come in on this because they were directly involved in a lot of this work. I mean, the data I've used is things like employment rates, unemployment rates, living wage jobs and other things. Obviously, there's public health data around diagnosis for depression and other things. But I do think that it is worthwhile supporting the fact that community wealth building is delivering a better local economy for residents in terms of actual real world outcomes. There's tons of data that can be used, I think. And, even when you manage to shift a contract from, say, a large company that might be headquartered in Greater London or the South East that may, for example, not be even headquartered in terms of tax and other things in this country, to a local business, you actually get an indication of how many jobs it does create. So there's other things like that. So say, for example, when we did refurbish our Harris Museum, this was a £19 million project. The principal contractor did provide figures of people employed within Preston on the project. Now there's about 300 employed, and I think 71% of them the spend was with companies of their suppliers with a Preston postcode. So there's local statistics you can get as well to prove this. The problem with community wealth building more generally is people don't want to see change, so they're bound to want to trash it and say it doesn't work. But I think there's a myriad of statistics as well. There's also some very strong statistics. There's a book called The Spirit Level about 10 or 15 years ago, very inspiring, by Professor Richard Wilkinson, which also showed things like, when you have more cooperatives within a community, and these were European examples, that, in terms of even things like life expectancy, it does slightly increase. In terms of things like mental well-being and violence in that community, they do decrease, because if you go to Mondragon or Emilia Romagna, there's some parts of that community where the cooperative economy is 30, 35, 40%, and by actually having ownership by the people quite dramatically within those communities, it does lead to many, many positive public health and societal outcomes. And this is evidenced, so this is why we did the work in Preston. We didn't want to have to have many people just saying that this is protectionism, it's not working, why didn't you spend it on more conventional things? We did want to prove with government statistics and other things it was working. So there's a myriad of statistics you can use. And I think also there's local statistics by looking at, if you do shift spending, for example, to a local company, they'll be able to tell you how many jobs they've created on a council project, which is positive, and how much they spend with local companies through the subcontractual arrangements as well. So yeah, there's tons and tons you can do. Thank you. Thanks,
Matthew. Sarah.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think Matthew's covered a lot of the key points. I think a simple way of doing it is to take those 5 pillars that I mentioned earlier and just think about your council's own footprint, economic footprint. So what is the size of, what's the total amount of money that you are paying for outsourced services? What percentage of those services of that money could be influenced? You know, is easy, because some of the things you pay for there'll be very few local suppliers for, and you'll be required to do by statute. But where are the contracts where it is possible to influence and shape those contracts in a way which will deliver better economic and social outcomes? So maybe just doing a bit of a benchmark to find out how much money you're spending, how much is influenceable, and then if possible, then how much of that money is being retained locally. And there are good sort of data sources that we use for that, like the Tussle data. Tussle data is a good place to look. The other thing you can do quite quickly is looking at your employees. So you know, where are your employees based? Are most of them in your area, or are you having a lot of people coming from elsewhere? What percentage of your employees come from perhaps areas with the highest levels of deprivation, or areas that you're a bit worried about in terms of regeneration? So that's another way of looking at it, because then easily you can start to think, well, how could we do targeted employment opportunities for people in those areas? And then a third option is to look at the data that you have on the land and property that you own as a council, and what are the opportunities to use that ownership to deliver kind of wider benefits. So particularly if you own your own homes, or if you have got, you know, a significant interest on the high street, how can you kind of really use that to deliver better outcomes for community ownership, to, you know, deliver benefits in terms of training for young people on construction projects, you know. So it's really about understanding your economic footprint, and a lot of that data will be in-house. And then when it comes to your suppliers, you know, making it part of the condition of contract that suppliers are providing you with some of that information so that you can understand the impact that they're having, but also the degree to which they are actually helping you to deliver on your corporate or economic development objectives. So that's some ideas from us.
Thanks, Sarah. Sam, do you have anything you want to add?
Nothing really in addition. I guess the other source of information that we might look at off the back of that kind of spend analysis is looking at sort of companies' data on Companies House. We have sort of subscriptions to the Data City, so that allows us to see, well, what are the organizations that you might then start to target your spend towards, and can you start to engage those markets? So lots of different sources. I think that the general question is sort of proving the long-term benefit. The benefits are so broad, as Matthew described. I think there's an interesting exercise going on in Oxfordshire at the moment to look at sort of marmot health indicators as a sort of as a sort of demonstration of you know, the impact of the public sector. That's sort of very complementary to a community wealth building approach, but obviously over a much longer term. So there's sort of data you can look at in the short term to identify what it is you're going to do, and then there's data that you can use to sort of monitor and track those long-term outcomes and the impact it's having. Yeah.
So we will go to the next question, which is from Stephen Barry Stanners. How can we embed community wealth building and cooperative practices in councils so that they are safeguarded against shock, whether they be social, economical or political, e.g. a change in control of a council? And I will go to Matthew to start with.
It's a very, very good question, and something that I think about a lot, to be honest, because obviously political fortunes do change. So yeah, I mean, my own view, as I said earlier, I think the council has to take a very strong lead, but I do think to have an effective community wealth building strategy and policies that are going to benefit people, you've got to work within communities and bring community wealth building to communities. So for example, within Preston, the bank we're establishing, that is a cooperative bank. Obviously, it's not a council-owned bank, even though the council's invested in it and influencing it. That will see the test of time, because obviously if there is a political change locally, the bank will still be down there. In terms of, say, the community land trust with the local church, again, the council is supporting it financially, but it's mainly an endeavour that's been done by them generally that we're supporting. So things like that will continue. And then if you are working with community organisations to adopt community wealth building and trade unions, they'll continue. So I do think that, you need an approach where you need to have strong leadership around this at a council level and a local government level, but that will go nowhere unless you actually get the community to support these ideas in the endeavours to embed community wealth building. So I do think it would take a step backwards if there were political changes in Preston or elsewhere, but I do think a lot of this has been put into an infrastructure in our communities that it will continue whoever does lead the council in the next few years. And obviously we're going through a reorganisation within Preston. So Preston will not exist, we expect, as a council. We'll be part of a bigger authority. But again, within that scenario, I do expect that community wealth building will continue to some degree.
Yeah, three quick responses to that. One is about embedding the changes in policy so that they become part of the procedures and institutional practice. So it's not perfect, because obviously that can be changed, but I think getting them embedded in that way of working is really important. Second, as Matthew said, getting community buy-in for this work and having that meaningful co-design and development of projects as a standard way of working, I think will also help to embed it. And then thirdly, working with your anchor institutions and building that partnership so it becomes more of the approach that we take in this place rather than of a single organisation. So that collaboration can also be really important in sort of safeguarding some of the stuff for the longer term.
Yeah, I mean, just the thing that came to mind when Matthew was speaking was again the example of Mondragon and the fact that system is entirely sort of independent of political of the state, and it's a very resilient, self sort of perpetuating system, and I think that speaks to some of what Matthew's talking about there about establishing institutions that have these kind of human imperatives at their core and are kind of continually working towards that. So yeah, it's always an inspiring example, Mondragon, but that's certainly an example where it's sort of managed to remain very resilient to economic, political and social change.
So I don't see any more questions. I do have one myself, which I will ask the panel. So in terms of anchor institutions, how do we get them to act collectively rather than in silos? And I'll go to Sarah first.
Sorry, just trying to find my mute button. Yeah, so I think that is a really important question, and it's about relationships, and it's about building those relationships, investing in time to build relationships with other organizations so that and taking that kind of relational approach so that we're starting to see people in those organizations rather than institutional barriers. And you want to get to a point where we're collapsing those institutional barriers in pursuit of a common goal. And I think the other bit about anchor institutions is I think it's it's commendable to get or anchor institutions in a room and agree we want to work together. But without a strong sense of purpose, it can kind of collapse. So I think having a really strong sense of purpose, using the idea of a shared interest in place, I think can help with that, because whilst organizations will have different processes and different ways of working, I think if we're all agreed that our primary interest is in the future of a place and ideally a specific element of that, I think that can help kind of collapse some of those institutional barriers. But fundamentally, it's about that those relationships and about understanding that if we work together to create that place-based standard, we're going to be much stronger than if we're trying to do it on our own. Because it, inevitably, a lot of the challenges that end up costing the public service the most money will be affecting everybody around the table, and trying to create a bit of common cause around how we coordinate and develop solutions to that together rather than individually, I think can be really powerful when it's done right.
Yeah, just 100% agree with everything Sarah said there. I think one of the things that can be can be a challenge is sort of maintaining that momentum when you begin to sort of coalesce these groups. And so I think there's something of fundamental importance is really sort of identifying those quick wins so that people can really start to see progress and can start to see a sort of a sense of direction evolving. So, you know, it can be, these things can easily get stuck in sort of strategyitis and you know, kind of become a lot of good talk, but not sort of progressing. So I think finding those practical actions that can really start to build momentum around that shared purpose is really, really fundamental as well.
I don't really have anything further to add on that, to be honest, so happy to leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I think that has now came to the end of this session. I just want to thank our panel, Sarah, Simon and Matthew, for joining us today and giving us the benefit of their expertise and knowledge in the area of community wealth building. I'm sure we've all got a lot out of it. This is our last topical session this week, other than our AGM, which is at 2 p.m. this afternoon. So please do come along to our AGM and hear about the work we've been doing over the last year in the network. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a good day.